Alright, so, the Great Depression. It was pretty damaging for the U.S. Actually, it was the most economically damaging event in U.S. history. Banks closed, unemployment and homelessness skyrocketed beyond numbers today, and a natural disaster known as the Dust Bowl, which completely coated the South in dust, as you would assume, leading to starvation and death. Very fun. It all started in the 1920s, also known as the Roaring Twenties. Almost directly after the end of World War I, the economy began rapidly expanding because everybody was putting their savings into the Wall Street stock market, which peaked in August 1929. Everybody expected the stock prices to keep rising, but with a world built on rubble from the previous war, we didn't need the factories anymore, so they shut them down and left people without sources of income. Food was also on the decline with the rising Dust Bowl issue and a drought plaguing the South. While all this was happening, the stock market kept expanding through the coming months. Alright, next up, the Mafia. You wouldn't think the Mafia would be a part of the Great Depression, but it was actually. The Mafia actually became super powerful during the Great Depression because of the Prohibition. The Prohibition was an alcohol ban that ran from the 1920s, started Roaring Twenties, to 1933. They profited by bootlegging and illegally brewing alcohol. This helped the underworld stay funded throughout most of the Depression. It was also better to become a part of the Mafia than to go broke. Organized crime became very prominent, and Al Capone's rise and fall occurred. The Dust Bowl was an additional catastrophe that was going on during this whole mess of a decade. When the Great Depression began, crop prices began falling, causing farmers to plow up grassland to harvest unusually productive crops and encourage them to tear up even more land. With no grass to hold the soil together, it began to blow away. These winds picked up loads of dried soil and turned them into massive dust storms that carried into other regions, killing their crops and covering them in dust, and in the process making it impossible to breathe, causing people to choke. These dust storms are very similar to the ones seen in the hit 2014 movie Interstellar. Back to the Great Depression's cause. On October 24th, 1929, billionaire investors began selling their extremely overpriced stocks all at once. The market crashed, and 12.9 million stocks were traded that day. That day was dubbed Black Thursday. On October 29th, only 5 days later, 16 million more stocks were traded. That day, millions of shares became worthless, and consumers lost all buying power. Bank runs became a common occurrence from 1930 to 1933. Bank runs were the result of everyone cashing out their stocks as quick as possible for cash. With high amounts of cash going out and no cash coming in from deposits, the banks were bound to run out of money. This forced the banks to take out large loans that they could not pay off. By early 1933, many banks had closed their doors and given up. We are not the only ones to suffer this great economic crash. Places such as Africa, Asia, Europe, and both North and South America were all affected. International trade dropped by 30%, and to protect their nation's industries, they began making and raising tariffs. Tariffs are basically taxes on imported goods. So if you were to buy an apple from China all the way over here, you would have to pay like $30. Even though the apple is $5, they're using resources to get it to you. So that's why it's the 30 extra. These taxes were the main reason why the global Great Depression continued. Places such as Germany, Japan, and Italy resorted to other means to fix their country. Fascism and militarism spread throughout these countries, and this was the start of Adolf Hitler's rise to power. He basically promised that he would fix their broken nation. The Great Depression was not a great time for the U.S. Besides all the crime, droughts, unemployment, and homelessness problems, there was another problem. As if we just couldn't get enough. Mortality rates severely dropped, starting with 12 people, ironically with a drop of their own. 12 traders, brokers, whatever you call them, jumped off buildings in Wall Street on Black Thursday. After that, it was like a call to action. Over the next 4 weeks, 44 more suicides were confirmed. More people died to suicide, starvation, and choking from the dust storms. Suicide rates changed from 7.1 to 1,000 people to 23.9 to 1,000 people. There was 20 confirmed cases of starvation, over 5,000 and over 5,000 unconfirmed from choking in the dust storms. The Great Depression was basically a void decade for the US. We accomplished absolutely nothing worthwhile, at least. And we invented things like Scotch tape and the chocolate chip cookie and discovered Pluto. Pluto didn't last very long. Compared to other nations, we handled it the worst. President Herbert Hoover basically said, "Nah, y'all got this," and watched as the nation crumbled around him. Eventually, he was met with so much backlash that he had to do something. So he did. He added taxes and built a dam. That also did not make people very happy. Let's just say he was not re-elected president. Then FDR was elected with his new wondrous New Deal. A bunch of experimental laws to get people back to work. It worked, and besides that, he also established a system that gave stability to banks so that you won't lose your savings if the market crashes again. My question was, how did the Great Depression affect the advancement of our nation? I think that's enough context. Now let's answer my question. How did the Great Depression affect the advancement of our nation? First, agriculture. Agriculture was one of the more important side effects of this depression. Crops died, livestock died, people died, all causing less and less to get done. Farming was a big part of America's economy at the time. Back then, we didn't have massive companies who owned farms. It was individual farmers who would use the money from their harvest to spend it on their family and support it. Sometimes living harvest to harvest. Next up, the relation between the government and the banking industry. Prior to the Great Depression, the federal government had nothing to do with the banking industry. There are polar opposites, minus taxing. Pay your taxes, people. During the Depression, when Hoover was president, he didn't do anything to help. But Roosevelt, when he was president, he stepped up with the Emergency Banking Act of 1933 to help. The emergency banking legislation passed by Congress today is most constructive step towards the solution of the financial and banking difficulties we have had confronted the country extraordinarily rapidly. With the legislative was enacted by Congress, heartens and encourages the country. This was said by the Secretary of the Treasury, William Woodin, on March 9th, 1933. In FDR's fireside chat, where he gave announcements, he said, quote, "I can assure you that it's safer to keep your money in a reopened bank than under the mattress." This completely changed the relationship between the government and banking. Now the government had safer plans for what to do just in case another crash would happen, and potentially fund you if you were to go broke. Next up, inventions. Prior to the Great Depression and the crash of the Wall Street stock market, same thing, I just wanted to use this image, World War I had just ended and the Roaring Twenties began, where everybody was pretty wealthy. People had more money to spend, so they started inventing things, like useful things, like the Band-Aid, traffic lights, insulin, and more entertainment-based items like chewing gum, the instant camera, the television, and the first U.S. radio station called KDKA, which hosted the first play-by-play baseball commentary, which is all super cool. But once the Depression hit, this list of inventions became exponentially smaller. Once the Great Depression and World War II was over, the number of inventions shot back up. Stuff like the color television, which it was an innovation, the aqualung, which is modern air tanks for scuba diving, the credit card, could have been extremely useful during the Depression, and get this, sliced bread. I wonder who used the saying first, and what they compared it to back then. Like, this is the first thing before this is the greatest creation of before sliced bread. An example of it is the microwave. The microwave was invented in the 1940s and discovered in a factory, which could have been discovered earlier if we hadn't closed the factories. There's our problem. How could the Great Depression been prevented? First off, a better stock market, predictors, or whatever they're called. We were too blind to realize that the market was going to crash. Also, better factory purpose. We should have repurposed all those weapon factories to food or clothing factories, which could have been cushion for the economy. Food silos and water reserves might have been helpful to prevent/negate the food shortage and the drought of the Dust Bowl. Overall, the Great Depression greatly, affected the advancement of our nation. First, it affected the agricultural side of things, forcing scrounging farmers to go broke, harvest on dry land, causing a drought. Next, the banking and federal government relationship with the Emergency Banking Act of 1933 and the banking laws put in place by FDR that I did not talk about. Finally, inventions. We couldn't advance in anything scientifically until after the Depression. Alright, so hopefully you've learned at least something from this video. Thank you for your time. Here's a little message from a representative of HCFCA on why this project should get an A. Thank you, good evening, and good night.
Hey, it's me with high schoolers for the betterment of Connor Anderson's grades. I come here today because what you've just seen is probably a great presentation on the Great Depression. The Depression, not so great. Presentation, probably top notch. Connor is a hard worker, and I know he's been putting a lot of effort into it. Now, on the topic of Great Depression, I personally would be very depressed if Connor got a bad grade on this. So you should totally keep that in mind while grading.